We now turn to the role of television in this American response that we've been talking about, this American response to the British invasion, and the role played by TV in helping to mount the American response to the great success of the British artists, starting with the Beatles in 1964. Now, when we think about the role of television in popular music, probably the place that we always go back to as our touchstone, our sort of original place, is American Bandstand. And we talked about American Bandstand way back when we were talking about the period between 1955 and 59, then especially that period between 59 and 63, a show coming out of Philadelphia hosted by Dick Clark, and a show that a lot of kids watched after school every day, mostly focused on dancing, was an important vehicle for a lot of the pop groups of the early 60s, the teen idols, the girl groups, people like that, the sweet soul groups, Drifters, Benny King, people like that. Well, as the 60s continued, these kinds of variety shows devoted to youth music started to spring up all over the place. The first one of the sort of a successor to, although American Bandstand remained on the air until '80. So when I talk about these other as being successors, I don't mean that American Bandstand went away. It continued to be very, very important. But one of the shows that came along after American Bandstand was already going was a show from the fall of 1964 called Shindig! On ABC. It was hosted by a fellow named Jimmy O'Neill, and it would have a lot of the current acts would appear on Shindig. What's interesting, for our story at least, is that the show that it replaced on ABC, when Shindig came in and was like sort of, British invasion, American pop kind of stuff, what it replaced was a song called Hootenanny, which had been devoted entirely to music of the folk revival. So, there you can see the folk revival being displaced by what was happening with the British invasion and American pop in the mid-1960s. Well, once ABC started to have some success with Shindig, that was followed in January of 1965 on NBC by a show called Hullabaloo. Essentially the same kind of show, right, with a variety show geared at a kind of teen pop audience. The one that's most important to our show, our story, however, it was one that was developed by Dick Clark of American Bandstand for CBS and appeared in the summer of 1965 at about the same time as Mr. Tambourine Man, Like a Rolling Stone. And that was one called Where the Action Is. And the reason why Where the Action is important to us is because the house band for Where the Action Is was a group called Paul Revere and the Raiders. And these other shows, Shindig and Hullabaloo, had lots of musicians on them, and they had regular sort of variety show kinds of hosts, but they didn't have a kind of house band. With Where the Action Is, you got to see Paul Revere and the Raiders on that show an awful lot. Paul Revere and the Raiders were a group that originated they're usually associated with the scene around the Pacific Northwest. In fact, they had recorded a version of Louie Louie not too long after the Kingsmen did, but it was the Kingsmen's album, the Kingsmen's song that got picked up for national distribution when it became a regional hit. And so Paul Revere and the Raiders kind of lost out. The group kind of broke up. The different guys, Paul Revere, who was the organ player, not the singer, drifted back to LA, got the group back together. The original lead singer, Mark Lindsay, came back. And so the group was back together in time to get this gig as the house band on Where the Action Is. But because the British had hit our shores, all these groups, the Beatles and the rest of them, they decided that what they would do, their gimmick would be they would wear American Revolutionary War outfits, complete with the three-cornered hats and the little buckled shoes and the stockings and the whole routine and the jackets and all that kind of thing. And so when you saw them, they were always wearing this Revolutionary War. Of course, the guy's name was Paul Revere, right? One if by land, two if by sea. And so you get this whole kind of American response to the British invasion, sort of Hollywood style. Anyway, these guys were also produced by Terry Melcher, who had produced The Byrds and recorded in LA there. That's where the show was filmed. Big hits for them, Just Like Me from '66, Kicks from '66, and Hungry from '66. In many ways, they took the garage band sound or the garage band approach and brought it more into the mainstream than anybody else, aside from the Kingsmen's hits. In fact, in many ways, Paul Revere and the Raiders taking their garage band sound and cleaning it up ended up sounding an awful lot like the Rolling Stones. But perhaps the biggest of these, when we start to talk about the influence of TV, perhaps the biggest figure for us to think about is this group, the Monkees. Now, it's very popular. The Monkees are maybe kind of People like the Monkees because they think it's in a kind of an ironic way, you know. Not that they think the Monkees are great, like the Beatles are great. They just think the whole Monkees thing is kind of cool and off and weird and this kind of thing, but kitschy maybe a little bit. But the Monkees are an interesting group because they are essentially constructed in the same way that like a teen idol would have been constructed in the early 60s. That is, people who are songwriters and producers and people like that are basically trying to find four guys who fit the suit. They already kind of have an idea how they want the group to go. They've got professional songwriters to write the music. But the difference is that the Monkees were never put together to be a musical act. The Monkees were put together as a TV cast for a weekly television show that would essentially be a television show version of the Beatles' A Hard Day's Night. And so they got guys who not only had some musical background, but who also had a background working in comedy troupes and acting and that kind of thing. So, for example, Davy Jones had appeared on Broadway. In fact, he appeared as a character doing a song from the musical Oliver on the same night on the Ed Sullivan Show that the Beatles appeared the first time. So he had a rich experience in the theater. Mickey Dolenz had been a child star in a show called Circus Boy, and so he had experience as an actor. And so these guys got together essentially to work out a kind of improvisational way of acting and interacting with each other. They spent so much time on that the musical part of it, like actually learning to play the instruments and be a band and stuff, kind of got pushed to the back burner. And so when the show was getting ready to come out, they had to real quick get this music together so there'd be music to support the show. So the music on those Monkees albums was played by a studio band, not unlike, as I said before, the musicians for the Byrds, Mr. Tambourine Man. They used their actual voices singing, but the songs were all written by somebody else. It was either written by a songwriting team of Tommy Boyce and Bobby Hart, two guys who were originally considered as potential members of the Monkees, but were consigned really to the songwriting end of it, and also former Brill Building songwriters led by Don Kirshner, remember, who had been half of the Al Don Publishing that had been part of the Brill Building scene. Now Kirshner was out in LA, like a lot of New York people had moved out to LA, and so you get a real kind of Brill Building kind of feel to a lot of this music. The songs are really, really well written. I mean, these are good tunes, and the playing and the production is fantastic. It's amazing when you listen to those Monkees songs how well they hold up just as pop records from the time, because they were really very well done. But the important thing is that the music was never intended to be the selling feature. When you bought that first Monkees album, you got an advertisement on the back of the album for the TV show. You know, it said something like, you know, seen on ABC TV, you know, 7:30 every Monday night. It was essentially kind of like a flyer with an album included, you know. But the music got really popular. I wouldn't say that it eclipsed the television show, but it certainly did very, very well on its own. The show debuted in the fall of 1966. What's interesting there is just at about the time the Beatles were giving up touring in the summer of 1966. They didn't want to do the touring anymore. They didn't want the matching suits. They didn't want the mop top haircuts. They released, in August of 66, released Revolver, and then went on to Penny Lane and Strawberry Fields and Sgt. Pepper. Just at the time they no longer wanted to be the mop top Beatles. In the fall of 1966, along come the Monkees, who then become the Mop Top Beatles. So at the same time, in 66 and 67, you've got the Mop Top Beatles, the Monkees are them, and you've got the new Beatles, the kind of long-haired beard hippie Beatles, and the actual Beatles themselves are them. And there's a split there between what we might call AM and FM that starts to occur that we'll deal with a little bit later. But a lot of these songs, I'm a Believer, we already talked about being written by Neil Diamond, a #1 hit in 1966. The B side of that record, I'm Not Your Stepping Stone, which was kind of a garage band tune, had also been done by Paul Revere and the Raiders, was #20. So you've got this instance of a sort of a double-sided hit for the Monkees. A Little Bit Me, A Little Bit You from 1967 went to #2. Pleasant Valley Sunday, written by Jerry Goffin and Carole King, Brill Building songwriting team, and now in LA, that went to #3 in 1967. Interestingly, the first two albums by the Monkees occupied the #1 slot in the album charts, either one or the other of them together, for 31 consecutive weeks from late 1966 to the summer of 1967. That's some pretty serious chart domination for the Monkees. The Monkees eventually got tired of being, the guys in the suits and wanted to do their own music, their own production. Mike Nesmith, the guitar player in the group, was actually a pretty good songwriter, but they wouldn't do any Mike Nesmith tunes for the Monkees. And so Mike Nesmith gave one of his songs, Different Drum, to Linda Ronstadt and her group, the Stone Ponies, and they had a hit with it on AM radio. So at the same time the Monkees were doing hits written by somebody else, one of the Monkees, a song written by a Monkees member, was a hit on the charts at the same time. Of course, they would all go on to have their own careers later after the Monkees broke up. So let's turn a little bit now to some of the other kind of outrageous things that happened once the Monkees kind of broke out on TV. And this will take us into the period of psychedelia and into the early 70s, but I think it's fun just to kind of see what develops. We've got a cartoon show, The Archie Show, based on the Archie comic books, featuring an animated band, the Archies, entirely studio musicians, because, of course, cartoons can't really play and write their own songs, right? So it's entirely written by songwriters. And anyways, this animated band has a #1 hit in 1969 with Sugar Sugar, interestingly written in part by Jeff Barry, who'd been one of the Brill Building songwriters. We have a group of chimps from the television show that debuted in fall of 1970 on ABC called Lancelot Link Secret Chimps. The actual group was called Lancelot Link and the Evolution Revolution. On every show, the chimps would get up and sort of play a pop song. They had a single and an album. The single was called Sha La Love You. We're talking about chimps now, folks. This all leads to a more kind of organized version of that, which is debuting in the 1970 on ABC, The Partridge Family, featuring Shirley Jones and David Cassidy as a kind of a teen heartthrob. I Think I Love You, a #1 hit in 1970. So, like I say, this is taking us into the early 70s. Other important sort of heartthrobs from that period. Bobby Sherman, who'd been on a show called Here Come the Brides as early as 1968, had a hit in 1970 with Julie, Do You Love Me? We start to see people like Donny Osmond, the young Michael Jackson, other teen idols, and it really starts to become AM bubblegum music. And this is something that we'll talk about in week number 7. Mostly when we talk about our history of rock music, when we get into the end of the 60s, we follow the groups that did album-oriented rock. We talk about Sgt. Pepper's being the first concept album, and then we start to talk about groups that did mostly albums. But it should be noted that in this sort of TV rock thing we've sort of touched on a bit here, these groups continued to have hits on AM radio. AM radio tended to be the place where these sort of teen hits, bubblegum music ended up getting a lot of airplay and a lot of time. And FM radio, which began to develop in 67, 68, ended up being the place where most of the rock that we talk about is happening. So at the same time I'm telling you about the Grateful Dead or about Led Zeppelin, you have to realize that on the charts at the same time were people like Donny Osmond, Michael Jackson, Bobby Sherman, David Cassidy. They were on the charts as well as part of it. We tend not to follow that story through. For us, maybe the interesting connection is this is all the shadow of Ricky Nelson, right? He's the first one back in the late 1950s who is on a big television show and uses the television show as a way of promoting his music. So in many ways, this stuff that we're talking about, this TV rock from the end of the 60s, early 70s, really is anticipated by Ricky Nelson, and all of it anticipates MTV. Which just about 10 years later, it's going to become very important that the video and the music go together during that period of time when, yes, MTV actually played music some of the time. So that concludes our discussion of the American response. In next week, when we will turn our attention to black pop in the 1960s, the music of Motown, Stax, and James Brown. And what we'll find out is that while all of this stuff was happening, the British invasion on one hand, these American responses we've talked about going on this week, we're mostly talking about American responses as they occurred in white pop. But in black pop, there was a lot of music that was on the charts that's very, very important for us to take note of and to figure into the equation. If you take the hits, for example, of the Beatles and the Supremes and put them right next to each other in their period between 1964 and 1966, it's amazing how the Supremes seem to match the Beatles almost step for step most of the way. And it's to that story we'll turn next week.